It's Thursday, April 16, 2026. I'm Albert Mohler, and this is The Briefing, a daily analysis of news and events from a Christian worldview. I want to start out with some recent headlines that have caught the attention of Americans, a bipartisan story. And so just in the last several days, two members of Congress had to resign over sex scandals. And that includes Eric Swalwell, who resigned as a Democrat from a congressional seat in California, even as he dropped out as a leading contender for the Democratic gubernatorial nomination there in California. Everything just fell apart for him in a matter of hours, certainly in a matter of days. He eventually had to not only drop out of the California governor's race, he also had to just resign from the House. And more on that in just a moment. But you also had Representative Tony Gonzales of Texas, a Republican, who also had to resign from the House rather than face discipline and an expulsion process. And in this case, it was because he also had been involved in sexual misbehavior. In the case of Eric Swalwell, I still have to use the legal definition that he is accused of having participated in sexual misbehaviors, even of sexual crimes. When it comes to Representative Gonzales, now former Representative Gonzales, the Texas Republican, it was about sexual misbehavior with a former staffer who later committed suicide. So we really are talking about very dark situations. In the case of Representative Swalwell, the interesting thing over the last several days has been that additional accusers have come forward. And you'll notice there's a word that is used by many in the media about these serious accusations. You'll hear the term credible put in front of either accusation or accuser. This is a credible accuser. It's a credible accusation. I've had several people ask, what does credible mean here? Well, at one level, credible means believable. There's credence to this claim. It doesn't mean that it's absolutely true. It does mean that it's likely to be true. And the other thing about credible in this context, this is what's really important, is that when they say this is a credible accusation, two things are supposed to apply. Number one, it could have happened. And number two, the accusation is coming with some kind of credible intent, some kind of credible force. And someone's willing to put their own name in terms of the accusation. So this isn't just a rumor. This is a credible accusation. And credible comes down to the fact that, number one, let's just say that a member of Congress is accused of having some kind of sexual impropriety with a woman. And let's just leave it in those terms right now. A male member of Congress, a woman accuser. If the congressman comes back and says, I've never met her, I don't know who she is, well, that at least means that for her accusation to be credible, there's going to have to be some explanation for how something like this could have happened if indeed they never met. And so that's an extreme situation just to make the point. The credibility rests on the fact that it could have happened. So that's one of the reasons why, by the way, specifics are called for. So if it's an accusation, specifics like who, what, where, when, and how. When did it happen? Where did it happen? Because when you're talking about this kind of behavior, if we're talking about physical behavior in a room, then let's just state the obvious. The two people have to be in the same city, in the same room, in the same space, on the same date. So all of that leads to credibility. Now, here's the other big factor here, and that is the fact that when the press is willing to go forward with a story like this, they have a credible accusation, a credible accuser, and a credible set of facts, like it could have happened. You know, the response from someone who is accused in this way is going to have to be, it couldn't have happened, or this credible accusation is likely to move forward. And that's exactly what both of these members of Congress understood. And as they understood this, here's the other thing. Why did they resign rather than face the disciplinary process? It is because in resigning, a couple of things apply. Number one, there never will be such a disciplinary process, which would have been observable to the public, which means all kinds of embarrassing things could have come out. Okay, it's more than that. In a sinful world, it's more than that. It is also that in that process, information and evidence could have come out that could be used against, say, one of these congressmen in a court of law, perhaps even in a criminal context. If not that, then in a civil context, being sued for damages. And so there are all kinds of reasons why these two representatives, following the pattern set by others, simply said, I am going to resign rather than face that process, because that process would be in itself devastating. Others have pointed to the fact there are financial issues. It would be an expensive process. You'd have to have lawyers. And by the way, both of these former representatives are likely to face a significant amount of legal complication. Let's just put it that way. But at least in this context, they avoid this disciplinary process and having to defend themselves in that context. The other thing is that they also, at least in some cases, are able to keep their government pensions. If you resign fast enough, then the disciplinary process cannot move forward against you in such a way that it would strip you of such privileges. So we are in a sinful world, and guess what? All kinds of complications come up in a sinful world, and that's really what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the big question behind this, which not enough people are asking. The big question is, how in the world does this kind of thing happen? I mean, let's just think about it for a moment. I saw a headline story in a newspaper just recently, and I didn't use it at the time, but I certainly made note of it. The headline was, how are these things happening now, decades after this crisis, that controversy, this scandal? You know, it's not like we don't know that these kinds of things happen. It's not that there are not rules against this kind of thing happening. It's not that the American public is morally confused about whether these things are right and wrong, but they keep happening over and over and over again. Okay, so this is where some good Christian, theological, ethical, biblical analysis is needed here. And it comes down to this. The scripture tells us, for instance, that sin will seize the opportunity. That's a very important thing. Sin will seize the opportunity. It's the Apostle Paul who in Romans chapter 7 makes that very clear, even as he knows what sin is. And even as he sets himself not to sin, he speaks of sin more or less just waiting for him, there to just trip him up, seizing the opportunity. Now, of course, what the Apostle Paul would say is that you have to prevent sin seizing that opportunity. That's our Christian responsibility. But it is a good warning for us that when you look at this kind of thing and you just see so many figures have been exposed in this kind of scandal, you know, in the 1950s, in the 60s, in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and now right now. And of course, you could go back to, I don't know, let's just say the book of Genesis and find similar kinds of things. How is it that these things happen over and over and over again? It is because sin is real. And the complex of sin, including the entire process of temptation, it is just the fact that many people do not set up the defenses and the policies in order to prevent this kind of thing from happening, which is to say, for Christians, the biblical worldview tells us that you have to put yourself in a situation where sin cannot seize the opportunity. And that is what's so crucial. That last word, opportunity. If you give sin the opportunity, then sin is going to seize that opportunity. If you put yourself in a situation where sin can happen, is likely to happen, is more likely than not to happen, if you put yourself in a situation of moral vulnerability and you have any say in how it happens, then you bear responsibility. You're basically inviting sin to seize the opportunity. You also have the reality that there are patterns of sin. So let's be honest about it. There are patterns of sin. There is, of course, a pattern of women committing sexual sins against men. Sometimes, even when it comes to, let's just say, a female teacher and a male high school student, those kinds of things happen. And those kinds of things are real. And the scripture is really clear about the fact that that is sin. Simply put, emphatically put. But more often, it goes another way. More often, it is a male who is initiating this kind of sinful action against a female. And sometimes it's a situation in which you not only have sexual immorality, you do have a situation in which you have a sinner seizing the opportunity. And the opportunity in some situations is created because you have an employer-employee relationship. You have a supervisor-supervisee relationship. You have a boss-employee relationship. And by the way, have you noticed how often that shows up in these congressional scandals? And one of the things that someone finally asked in the last several days is, what is it about congressional offices that leads to so many of these scandals happening? Okay, so let's just talk about something bluntly. And this is not to cast suspicion upon individual members of Congress. We're talking about a systemic problem, a policy problem. When you have a situation in the business world, guess what? A lot of companies have had to revise their policies and even adopt far better policies and even make the cost of misbehavior even more emphatically clear in order to prevent this kind of thing from happening. And they often put men and women together in situations, but at least they make very clear that there are rules. Now, again, there are corporate scandals. The same thing happens. Sin seizes the opportunity, and people are inviting sin to seize the opportunity. They're giving themselves to sin. But when it comes to congressional offices, one of the big problems is that you have one person who clearly the office revolves around, and that's a United States senator in terms of the Senate side. It's a member of the House of Representatives. On the other side, it's a congressman or a congresswoman. And so the office revolves around them. It has to. And the staff, by the way, don't even have any constitutional status. It is simply the members of the Senate and the elected members of the House who have that constitutional status. But they do have jobs to do. They require staff. And that staff is often located, even physically, in pretty close proximity. Those House offices, it's not far in many cases. Where you have staff located apart from the member of Congress or the senator. And so all that is to say that all kinds of things can happen. They're working all kinds of hours. They're traveling because that's a part of the responsibility of either a senator or a member of Congress as well. They're traveling. They have staff traveling with them. All kinds of complications that can happen here. And so one of the things we see is that sin will seize the opportunity. Again, we're told that. So we need all kinds of policies in place to make certain that the right things happen and the wrong things don't happen. But there's another aspect to this, and that is power. And let's just consider the fact that when it comes to some members of Congress, and look at some of these scandals, and of course, they've happened in the White House as well. Let's just remember, this goes all the way up the food chain. The issue is power is very attractive. And it just so happens that very attractive nature of power can be incendiary when it comes to these kinds of scandals. And so it can be in business, it can be a rich man or a rich person, but power has an incredible seduction. And if you're wondering about how that works, just think about King David in the Old Testament, whose testimony I think would be that he allowed sin to seize the opportunity. He gave it the opportunity. He gave himself to the opportunity because, after all, he was the king. So I want to make clear the timing, and this has to do with the resignation of these two members of the House. And I think at this point, it's just helpful in one way that's morally clarifying that one was a Republican and one was a Democrat. The thing they had in common was that they allowed themselves to be put in a situation in which, number one, this kind of accusation could be made against them. And that kind of accusation could be credible. And then behind that, you have them resigning from office rather than face the disciplinary process. At that point, regardless of what they say, we basically know all we need to know. But I am not saying this in order to speak to politicians about their unique vulnerability. I want to speak about this to Christians, understanding that every single one of us in our own sphere, every single one of us is responsible to make certain not only that this kind of thing doesn't happen, but that just in terms of what we can do and what we must do, it can't happen. Okay, so we're going to shift now to talk about a couple of issues that arise from pieces published in The Economist of London. I mention this because The Economist is so influential. It's kind of like a combination of the Wall Street Journal and Time Magazine, something like that, for Great Britain. It's very interesting because it comes from a very, very interesting economic and political background. It's really the establishment, in a big way, the establishment. And the city of London, which, by the way, of course, you have London, you're speaking about the big megalopolis, a huge metropolitan area. There is a financial district that is Old London, which is officially, legally called the City of London. If you're in London, it's often referred to as the city. You think we're in the city. No. The financial district over there, that's the city. When you say the city, it's the equivalent of saying Wall Street in the United States. You know what you're talking about. All right. So The Economist comes from that world. And The Economist, however, represents a political tradition, certainly over the course of the modern identity of this major newspaper or magazine. That identifiable worldview is libertarianism. And sometimes issues arise and you realize, okay, we need to recognize that there is this libertarian argument out there, and you need to know how it works and how it's tied together. There is a confusion among many conservatives that libertarianism is just a form of conservative thought. It's actually not inherently conservative, although conservatives and libertarians will agree at least on some policies. But the big issue here is where we disagree. All right? So article number 1, The Economist. Here's an article, quote, Sir Keir Starmer, that's the British Prime Minister, is Britain's best hope for legalizing assisted dying. Subhead in the article, he should stop dawdling. So here you have the editorial board of The Economist, again, hugely influential, hugely powerful, calling upon the Labour Prime Minister to push through, based on his own prime ministerial authority and the power he has as the controlling officer there in Parliament, to force through the legalization of assisted suicide. The way it's put here is legalized assisted dying. So let's just remind ourselves of the euphemism. This is assisted suicide. This is self-death. It's medically assisted, which means doctors in the medical establishment are involved. It's often referred to by the euphemism MAID, for medical assistance in dying. It's all a matter of trying to avoid the central moral issues. But the important thing I want us to see here is that The Economist thinks that it would be a wonderful thing for Britain to adopt legalized assisted dying, assisted suicide. Now, why would The Economist make this argument? Well, it is because the worldview behind this is the worldview of libertarianism, and that is the worldview that says that the highest good is the exercise of human libertarian choice and freedom. So in other words, what's wrong is what limits human choice. What's right is what recognizes, authorizes, and respects human choice. Now, when you talk that way, you recognize that you can see why there's a lot of overlap with conservative thought. Just take the idea of a free market economics, the idea that you should have government stay out of interventions in the economy should work. The bottom line in the economy is that consumers exercising their choice actually will determine what works and what doesn't work in the economy. And so that's a basic principle. And you know what? Conservatives overwhelmingly, especially in the United States, have supported candidates who support that kind of economic philosophy. And so Ronald Reagan, for example, elected president of the United States in 1980, ran clearly on this kind of free market identity and policy. Now, by the way, one of the libertarian mantras you will hear is free markets, free minds. And there are some who actually use that. And again, so the free markets are one thing. We understand what that means. But free minds means you also are rejecting any kind of ideological authority. Okay, so let me just state the obvious, and that is that when you talk about the Christian understanding, the biblical understanding of the sovereignty of God and the lordship of Christ, let's just say that puts some rather severe limits on human libertarian freedom. Guess what? We also have the law of God directed to us. Guess what? God has made us in his image, and yes, we have the experience of making choices, etc. You walk in the ice cream store, you can legitimately choose what flavor of ice cream you want, how many scoops, 1 scoop of this, 1 scoop of that. Yes, you can exercise that freedom. But the Christian worldview says you don't have the freedom to define murder in your own terms. You don't have the freedom to decide that you're going to have sex outside of marriage. You don't have freedom to disobey the law of God. And for Christians, the understanding of what it means to be faithful is to submit ourselves to the lordship of Christ and to the authority of Scripture, to the faith once for all delivered to the saints. That runs directly contrary to that libertarian idea. Okay, so let's take some concrete issues. LGBTQ revolution. The libertarian position is, hey, their sex lives are their own. They can determine their own priorities. They can live by their own rules. Society doesn't have the right to constrain them. The issue of abortion, the libertarian argument, usually there's sometimes a modified libertarian argument that tries to be pro-life, but in its essence, the libertarian argument is, hey, it's her body. She can do with it as she wills. Again, human libertarian, human moral freedom. When it comes to assisted suicide and demanding the right to end your own life, guess what? A libertarian worldview is going to have to say, that's your position. The law should respect that decision that you make. Medical assistance in dying should be provided by the government. That's exactly what The Economist is arguing in this article. Interestingly, this article rejects the conservative arguments against this law, saying that, for one thing, there's the risk of coercion. There's the risk of people being coerced effectively, and especially in financial coercion. You know, you need to go ahead and end your life because otherwise your family is going to go broke paying these medical bills. That is a coercive argument. You could also have people who are coerced even against their will. If you're going to say that this is just a libertarian freedom issue, well, you know what? The fact is that a person dying in a hospital bed just might not be in the strongest position even to know how to exercise that libertarian freedom. There are those who would exercise that supposed freedom for them. It's also interesting that the editors here of The Economist say the most compelling argument against the current bill is, quote, that it is too narrow. Not that it's too broad, that it's too dangerous, but rather that it's too narrow. Listen to this. The risk is not, I'm reading directly from their statement, the risk is not that it would be too easy to get an assisted death, but that vanishingly few people would qualify, end quote. In other words, in order for this assisted suicide thing to work, you're going to have to make it available to more people and more people and more people. You're going to have fewer rules, not more. I just think it's really healthy for us to see the clash of worldviews here. We can stand at times on common ground with libertarians, say in making arguments for religious liberty. Yeah, we can make those arguments with a libertarian, but our argument goes beyond the libertarian argument. And when it comes to some of these other things, it's going to be contrary to it. Okay, I told you there was a second piece. Here's a news article from The Economist. Here's the headline, quote, "There's little prospect of legalizing abortion in Brazil." The Economist ran this, and you have the subhead, "Other large countries in Latin America have either legalized or decriminalized." They're talking about abortion. Okay, so when you look at that headline, you understand what's going on here. In other words, the editors of The Economist are basically criticizing Brazil for the fact that there is at present little prospect of gaining, as they would see it, legalized abortion in Brazil. So they're running the argument saying, that really kind of requires an explanation. Why is Brazil making it so difficult to legalize abortion? They recognize, by the way, that a couple of the reasons here have everything to do with theology and Christianity. And it is, interestingly, two different arguments. One of them is the Catholic argument, and Brazil has been historically overwhelmingly Catholic. And the Catholic argument is against abortion and certainly rejects a woman's so-called right to an abortion. But the growing argument, and the one that's growing in political influence, is the evangelical Christian argument in Brazil, an incredible revival of evangelical Christianity there. And by the way, it's coming in some mixed forms, some more theological and more clearly gospel than others. But I have been there, and I can tell you there is an explosion of gospel evangelical Christianity and wonderful churches among evangelicals there in Brazil, and I'm very thankful for that. But it is interesting that The Economist recognizes, hey, we have to know who we're up against in terms of legalizing abortion, and it turns out that Catholics and gospel-minded evangelicals are real sources of opposition to this, and with political effect. It's also very telling that the Economist article compares Brazil, where because of this public pressure, the legislature, the government has not moved forward with legalizing abortion. They compare that with Colombia, and I'm going to read from their article, quote, "where public support for abortion is also weak, but there, quote, it was the Supreme Court that legalized the procedure." Okay, just recognize they're celebrating that. It's right there in that sentence you just heard. They're celebrating the fact that in Colombia, even though public support for abortion was weak, the courts pushed it through anyway. That is exactly what happened in the United States of America in the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973. Just notice that it's the left that celebrates that. It's also many libertarians who celebrate that, because their argument is that the greatest good is human libertarian freedom, and a woman ought to have the right to choose an abortion if that's what she wants. I just want to point out again, for Christians, it is a basic theological argument. It's a basic ontological argument, which has to do with being. We believe that the being of that little, even microscopic human being, it is fully deserving of respect. For from the moment of fertilization until natural death, that is a human being made in the image of God. Another reminder of what's at stake in all of this. We are in a clash of worldviews, and there's no way to avoid it. You look at this and you recognize, well, part of this is about Great Britain. And then another one of these articles, even from a London news source, has to do with Brazil. They make reference to Colombia. And, of course, there are references to Canada, which already has legislation very similar to what people in Britain are seeking. And then you think about states in the United States of America where you have these kinds of arguments being made right now. You have the clash of blue America and red America. It's just important we recognize that on issues like this, the worldview issues are inescapable. It's just incredibly important that Christians understand that. And we also understand that there are some people who are not just classically progressive, nor are they classically conservative. There are those who identify themselves, many of them quite consistently, as libertarians, which means on some points they agree with red, on some points they agree with blue. Our point is that for Christians, our consistency should be biblical. And if we put human libertarian freedom at the top of the list of our priorities, let's just say, Houston, we have a problem. The Christian worldview understands that any worldview that doesn't begin with the one true and living God and is not premised upon the lordship of Jesus Christ is not just weak, it's unsustainable. And at the end of the day, deadly. Thanks for listening to The Briefing. For more information, go to my website at albertmohler.com. You can follow me on X or Twitter by going to x.com/Albert Mohler. For information on the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, go to spts.edu. For information on Boyce College, just go to boycecollege.com. I'll meet you again tomorrow for The Briefing.